I just turned 100 years old. Say that number out loud sometime. 100 years. It doesn't sound real even to me, and I'm the one who lived it. I was born before television existed in most homes, before men walked on the moon, before the word computer meant anything to anyone. I have outlived 2 houses, 3 cars, 1 country's borders that no longer exist on a map, and more friends than I can count without my chest tightening. I have watched a century pass, the way you might watch weather move across a field, slowly, and then all at once. Last week, my family gathered in my living room. There was a cake with more candles than the fire code probably allows. There was a banner, hand-painted, hung slightly crooked, because my 7-year-old great-granddaughter insisted on doing it herself, and nobody had the heart to fix it. And somewhere between the candles and the singing and the too sweet frosting, I still ate 2 slices of. My grandson, a grown man now, with his own gray creeping into his beard, knelt down next to my chair. He took my hand the way you take the hand of someone you're afraid might not be there next year. And he asked me the question that, I've come to learn, almost everyone eventually asks the oldest person in the room. Grandma, what do you know now that you wish you'd known then? I want you to understand something about that moment. 100 years does not fit into a sentence. It doesn't fit into an evening. I have lived through things I have never told another living soul, and I was being asked to compress it all into a party favor, a nice quote for a nice moment. I almost gave him something small. A joke, a deflection. That's what old people do sometimes. We protect people from the weight of what we actually know, because we love them and the truth is heavy. But I looked at his face, and I looked at the faces of the great-grandchildren I likely won't see grow into old age themselves. And I thought, if not now, when? I didn't answer that night. I told him I needed to think about it properly, and he laughed and said, "Take your time, Grandma. You've got," and then he stopped himself, because we both knew how that sentence was supposed to end, and neither of us wanted to finish it. I thought about it for 3 days. I sat in my chair by the window, the one that gets the afternoon light, and I let 100 years move through my mind like water through a narrow channel, all of it trying to fit through at once. And what came out, in the end, was not one answer. It was 5 lessons, 5 things that cost me something real to learn, not things I read in a book, not things anyone handed to me gently, things that took years, and in some cases, took people from me, before I finally understood them. I'm not going to give them to you the way they hand out advice on a mug or a poster in a dentist's waiting room. I'm going to tell you the stories underneath them, because a lesson without its story is just a decoration. It's the story that makes it stick to your ribs. So settle in. This will take a little while. But so did I. It took me almost 30 years to understand this, and it cost me most of my 30s to truly believe it. Most of what worries you will not matter in 5 years. But you will spend those 5 years suffering anyway, unless you catch yourself in the act. When I was 26 years old, I did not sleep for 11 nights in a row. Not because of a war, not because of a death, because of a dinner party. I know how foolish that sounds now, but at the time, it consumed me completely. I had invited my husband's employer and his wife to our home, a small home, a home I was embarrassed of, with furniture we had bought second-hand and mismatched. I worried about the tablecloth. I worried about whether the roast would be dry. I worried that my laugh was too loud, that my opinions were too strong, that somehow, in one evening, I would reveal myself as not good enough, and it would cost my husband his career. I made 3 different versions of a pie. I rearranged the furniture 4 times. I lay awake at 2 in the morning, rehearsing conversations that hadn't happened yet, inventing insults nobody had said, defending myself against accusations that existed only in my own mind. The dinner happened. It was, by every account, a perfectly pleasant evening. The employer complimented the roast. His wife asked for my pie recipe. Nobody remembered the tablecloth. Nobody noticed the furniture. Do you know what I remember most clearly about that entire episode, 74 years later? Not the dinner. I barely remember the dinner at all. What I remember is the exhaustion, the specific hollow exhaustion of 11 sleepless nights spent defending myself against a threat that never existed. I want to tell you something that took me decades to fully absorb. I cannot, today, remember most of the things I worried about across my life. Not the specifics. I remember the feeling, that tightness behind the ribs, that particular flavor of dread, but the actual content of the worry has simply dissolved, the way morning fog dissolves off a field once the sun is high enough. Time takes these things without asking your permission. There is a particular kind of arrogance hidden inside worry, though nobody tells you this when you're young. Worry convinces you that if you suffer enough in advance, you can somehow control the outcome. That if you turn a problem over in your mind enough times, you are doing something productive. You are not. You are only paying a debt in advance for a disaster that, more often than not, never arrives to collect it. I think of my neighbor Eleanor, who I knew for almost 60 years before she passed. Eleanor worried about her son's marriage for nearly a decade. Worried he'd married the wrong woman. Worried they'd divorce. Worried about what it would do to her grandchildren. She spent birthdays distracted by it. She spent holidays quietly miserable, running scenarios in her head at the dinner table, while everyone around her laughed and passed the potatoes. Her son and his wife are still married, 41 years now. Eleanor died 3 years before their 40th anniversary, having spent a full decade of her limited, precious life suffering over a marriage that was, the entire time, simply fine. I am not telling you this to shame anyone who worries. I was one of you for most of my life, and in truth, some small ember of it never fully leaves you, even at 100. What I am telling you is this: the people and things that hurt me most across 100 years were almost never the ones I feared. They arrived, almost without exception, from directions I never thought to watch. So if there is something keeping you up tonight, some fear circling your chest like a moth around a porch light, I am not going to insult you by saying, just stop. I know it doesn't work that way. But I want you to hold this thought gently, the way you'd hold something fragile. This will very likely not matter in 5 years, and you are going to spend those 5 years feeling something, regardless. So you may as well try, gently, to spend them feeling something other than dread. The second lesson took me a marriage of 52 years and then a widowhood to fully understand. Love is not a feeling that happens to you. It is a decision you make again, quietly every single morning, whether or not the feeling shows up to help you. I married my husband, Walter, when I was 22. I want to tell you honestly, because I think honesty is the only gift worth giving at 100 years old, that I did not always love him the way people imagine love in films, that swelling, breathless, certain thing. There were years, I would guess at least 6 or 7 scattered across 5 decades, where I woke up next to that man and did not particularly like him. There was a stretch in our 30s, after we lost a baby before she was born, where we barely spoke for almost a year. We shared a bed and a kitchen table and a grief so enormous neither of us knew how to hand it to the other person without dropping it. I remember standing at the kitchen sink one evening during that year, washing a single plate, because we had stopped even eating dinner together, and thinking, with total clarity, I don't know if I love this man anymore. Here is what nobody told me, and what I had to learn entirely on my own. Standing at that sink, the feeling leaving does not mean the love is gone. It means the love has, for a while, stopped being a feeling and started being a decision. And a decision, unlike a feeling, is something you have power over. So the next morning, I made him coffee the way he liked it. Too much sugar, which I always thought was a waste of good coffee. And I sat with him while he drank it, not because I felt anything in particular, but because I had decided, quietly, without telling him, that I was choosing him again that day. And the next day, I did it again. And slowly. I could not tell you exactly when. The feeling found its way back, the way a plant finds its way back after a hard frost. Once you keep watering it, even when it looks dead. We were married for 52 years. People, especially young people, ask me if we were happy the entire time, as if happiness were a state you achieve once and then simply maintain, like a fresh coat of paint. We were not happy every day. We had our version of that lost year more than once, in smaller forms. There were arguments about money, about his mother, about the way he chewed his food, if I'm honest, about how small marital resentment can get. But every single one of those mornings, I chose him. And on the mornings I know, now, that he did not particularly feel it either, he chose me back. Walter died in the spring, 11 years ago now, in the bed we had shared for over 5 decades. I did not, in that final hour, think about the arguments. I did not think about the year we barely spoke, or the sugar in his coffee, or any of the 100 small irritations a long marriage accumulates like sediment. I thought about the choosing. 52 years of it, every single morning, an act of will, repeated so many times, it eventually stopped feeling like an act of will at all, and simply became who I was. And I understood, finally, standing at his bedside, that love was never the feeling. The feeling is lovely when it visits, a bonus, a grace note. But the feeling was never the thing itself. The choosing was the thing itself. All along, if you are young and you are waiting to feel something before you commit to someone, I understand that instinct completely. But I want you to know that the feeling is not the whole architecture of a life together. The choosing is the architecture. The feeling is just the weather that passes through it. The third lesson cost me the most, and I would trade almost anything I own to have learned it sooner. Say the important thing now, because there is no later holding a place for you. Later is not a guarantee. It never was. I had a sister. Her name was Ruth, and she was 11 months older than me. Irish twins, our mother used to call us, though we weren't Irish at all. We grew up sharing a bed, sharing clothes, sharing the particular language sisters invent that nobody else can translate. When I was 58 years old, Ruth and I stopped speaking. I wish I could tell you it was over something significant, a betrayal, a great wrong, something that would at least make the silence feel earned. It was not. It was a comment she made at a family dinner about how I raised my children, said in front of everyone, said with the particular carelessness only a sister can manage, because only a sister knows exactly where the soft places are. I said something back. Something sharp, something meant to wound the way I'd been wounded. She left the dinner early, and then, the way these things do when neither person is willing to be the first to bend, the silence simply continued. A week became a month became a year became 6. I told myself, across all 6 of those years, that there would be time. That was the lie I lived inside, comfortably, the way you live inside a house, without noticing the foundation is cracked. I thought, she'll come around, or I'll call her at Christmas, or once things settle, we'll talk. I treated later as though it were a bank account I could draw from whenever I finally decided I was ready to make the withdrawal. Ruth died on a Tuesday morning in October. A stroke, sudden, no warning, no illness that had given us the terrible gift of preparation. I was going to call her that Friday. I had actually written it on a small piece of paper stuck to my refrigerator, "Call Ruth," as though her entire existence, our entire sisterhood, could be filed away like an errand between the grocery list and a dentist appointment. I did not get to make that call. I do not know, to this day, what I would have said. I have imagined that conversation perhaps 10,000 times in the years since, and it changes slightly every time, because I am still, even now, trying to write an ending that never actually happened. What I know is this: I spent 6 years protecting my pride instead of protecting my sister. I spent 6 years assuming that the relationship would simply wait for me in a drawer, unchanged, ready to be picked back up the moment I decided the timing was convenient. Relationships are not drawers. People are not drawers. They do not wait, unchanged, for your convenience. They live and breathe and, eventually, they end, sometimes on a Tuesday morning, with no announcement at all. I think, often, of how many people are living inside their own version of my 6 years right now. A parent they haven't called, a friend they had a falling out with over something that will not matter in 5 years. You'll remember that from the first lesson. A child they are waiting for the right moment to tell they're proud of. An old flame they wonder about, but never reach out to, because reaching out feels vulnerable, and silence feels safe. I need you to hear this from someone standing on the far side of the regret, because that is the only vantage point from which this lesson can truly be taught. The right moment you are waiting for is not coming. It is not being held for you. Today, this very ordinary Tuesday you are living through right now, is the closest you will ever come to the right moment. Say the thing, make the call, send the message you've drafted and deleted 4 times. I did not get a later with my sister. Please, for the love of whatever you hold sacred, Do not assume you will get yours. The fourth lesson took me the better part of 60 years and an embarrassing amount of foolish pride to finally set down. Nobody is thinking about you nearly as much as you believe they are. Almost everyone is far too busy worrying about themselves. When I was young, truly young, in my teens and into my 20s, I lived as though I were the main character in a film that everyone else had paid admission to watch. I rehearsed conversations before I had them. I replayed small mistakes for days, sometimes weeks, turning them over and over like a stone in my pocket, convinced that everyone who had witnessed the mistake was replaying it too, judging me, filing it away as evidence against me. I remember, with a clarity that still makes me wince, a moment at a community dance when I was 19. I tripped. Nothing dramatic, just a small stumble over my own shoe, in front of perhaps 30 people. I did not dance again for the rest of that evening. I sat in a folding chair against the wall, mortified, convinced that every person in that hall was thinking about my stumble, discussing it in low voices, filing it away as the defining fact of who I was. I asked my dance partner years later, decades later actually, at a reunion, if he remembered that night. He remembered the dance. He did not remember me tripping at all. He had, in fact, been far too consumed that entire evening worrying about whether a particular young woman named Dorothy would agree to dance with him. My humiliation, the one that had cost me an entire evening of joy, had not even registered as a footnote in another person's memory. This became, over the decades, an almost universal truth I collected evidence for again and again. I stayed quiet in meetings I should have spoken up in, certain my ideas would be judged as foolish. I avoided wearing colors I loved because I feared they'd be too much. I declined invitations, avoided risks, softened opinions, all in service of managing an audience that, it turns out, was never really watching in the first place, because they were far too occupied managing the audience they believed was watching them. I think of all the years I spent being careful instead of being honest. All the parties I did not fully enjoy because I was monitoring myself instead of living inside the moment. All the ideas I did not share, the questions I did not ask, the jokes I did not tell, because I was so certain that one misstep would be cataloged and remembered by people who, in truth, could barely remember what they'd eaten for breakfast that same morning. If I could reach back through the decades and speak to that 19-year-old girl sitting against the wall, humiliated over a stumble nobody else remembered, I would tell her this: go ahead and be embarrassing. Go ahead and be wrong sometimes, loudly, in front of people. Go ahead and wear the color you love and say the unpopular opinion and laugh too loud at your own joke. Almost nobody is keeping the score you fear they're keeping. They are too busy keeping score on themselves. It is, I think, one of the strange mercies of being 100 years old. You finally, truly, stop caring what the room thinks. I only wish it hadn't taken quite so long to arrive at something so simple and so freeing. And the fifth lesson, the one that took the full 100 years, and which I only understood with complete clarity this past week, standing in my living room surrounded by cake and crooked banners, is this: a good life is not measured by what you accumulated. It is measured by who was in the room at the end. Across 100 years I have owned things. I have owned 3 houses, each one nicer than the last, each one I was, at the time, enormously proud of. I have owned cars I saved for years to afford. I have owned jewelry, a fur coat I wore exactly 4 times before deciding it made me itch, dishes I bought for a wedding registry and used perhaps a dozen times before they sat gathering dust in a cabinet. I could not, today, tell you the make or model of a single car I ever owned. I would have to think for a long moment to remember the street address of the second house, the one we lived in for almost 20 years. The fur coat, I recall only because my granddaughter found it in a closet last year and wanted to know if it was vintage now, which made me feel approximately 1,000 years old rather than a mere 100. What I remember, with a clarity that has not dimmed even as so much else has faded, is who was in the rooms of my life. I remember Walter's hand finding mine under the table during a difficult dinner with his mother, a small squeeze that said, "I see you, I'm on your side," without either of us saying a word. I remember my children's laughter echoing down a hallway on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of evening so unremarkable at the time that I nearly didn't notice it was happening, and which I would now give almost anything to live inside again for even 1 more hour. I remember Ruth before the 6 years, before the silence, before the Tuesday morning that took her, laughing so hard at something I'd said that she could not breathe, doubled over at our mother's kitchen table, tears streaming, both of us 17 and 19, and utterly certain we had all the time in the world. Last week, at my party, they sang to me. 100 candles worth of heat rose up toward my face, and I closed my eyes for just a moment before I blew them out, and in that moment I looked, really looked, around the room. My children, gray-haired now themselves. My grandson holding my hand, the one who'd asked me the question that started all of this. My great-granddaughter, 7 years old, so proud of her crooked banner, utterly unaware that she was, in that moment, becoming one of the memories I will carry for whatever time I have left. And I understood, finally, with the full weight of a century behind the understanding, what the entire 100 years had actually been about. It was never about the houses, it was never about the cars, or the jewelry, or the coat that made me itch. It was never even about the accomplishments I was, at various points, so terribly proud of. A well-run household, a garden that won a small local prize one summer, a reputation for hosting a good dinner party once I'd finally recovered from my dinner party terror decades earlier. It was about who I built the life with. It was about who was standing in the room holding my hand when the candles were lit. That is the only inheritance I actually want to leave behind. Not the furniture, though my children are welcome to fight over the good armchair if they'd like. Not the money, though I hope it helps in whatever small ways money helps. What I want to leave behind is this understanding, passed to you the way it was never quite passed to me until it was almost too late to use it. Spend your life collecting people, not things. Things do not hold your hand in a hospital room. Things do not sing to you on your 100th birthday. Only people do that. So if you ask me, the way my grandson asked me, what I know now that I wish I'd known then, here is my answer. Gathered up from a full century of living, loving, losing, and, eventually, slowly, understanding. Worry less. It is not preparation, and it will cost you more than the thing you're worrying about ever will. Choose love daily. The feeling is a lovely guest when it visits, but the choosing is the house it lives in. Say the important thing today. There is no later holding a place for you. I learned that with a piece of paper on a refrigerator that never got its phone call made. Care less what people think. Almost nobody is watching as closely as you fear. They are far too busy worrying about themselves. And spend your life collecting people, not things. At the end, in whatever room you find yourself in, it is only ever the people who matter. It took me a full century to learn these 5 things. 30 years for the first, 41 for the second, a sister's death for the third, 60 years of foolish pride for the fourth, and the entire 100 years, right up until last week, for the fifth. I am giving all 5 of them to you now, for free, in far less time than it took me to earn them. Please, I mean this with everything 100 years of living has left in me. Do not wait as long as I did.